I've always loved the isolation of late-night driving, but there is a distinct difference between being alone and being completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was a little past 2 a.m., and I was exactly 14 hours into what was supposed to be a 20-hour straight shot across the country. I was young, broke, and too stubborn to pay for a hotel unless I absolutely had to. But the weather had other plans. A torrential downpour had started around midnight and steadily evolved into a blinding, biblical deluge. My windshield wipers were useless, snapping back and forth with a frantic rhythm. My knuckles were bone white on the steering wheel, my eyes burning from exhaustion. When my tires started hydroplaning for the third time, I knew I had to pull over before I ended up in a ditch. I took the very next off-ramp. There were no gas stations or familiar fast food signs, just an unlit, two-lane blacktop snaking out into the dark fields. I drove for another agonizing 2 miles before a sickly, buzzing neon light bled through the sheets of rain ahead. The sign read, Starlight Inn. The R and the I were burnt out. Below it, a smaller sign flickered with a desperate red, vacancy. It was an L-shaped strip of single-story rooms facing a cracked asphalt parking lot. I pulled under the small awning of the main office, killed the engine, and took a deep breath. I just needed to sleep for 5 hours. That was it. A bell chimed harshly as I pushed the heavy glass door open. The lobby was suffocatingly warm and smelled fiercely of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and cheap lemon cleaner. Behind a scuffed plexiglass window stood the night manager. He didn't greet me. He just stood there, staring. He was unnervingly tall and gaunt, with hooded dark eyes completely devoid of warmth. "I need a room," I said, my voice sounding weak over the drumming rain outside. He didn't move toward the register right away. He just tilted his head, his eyes lazily scanning me from head to toe, then looking past me out the window to my loaded-down sedan. "Awful night to be out on the road," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Just you?" "Yeah," I replied, instinctively regretting the honesty. "Just me." He slid a registration card under the glass. As I filled it out, I could feel his gaze boring into the top of my head. "Long drive," he noted. "Anyone expecting you to check in? Hate for folks to worry in this storm." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was disguised as polite small talk, but his tone was entirely flat, probing. "My brother," I lied smoothly. "He's tracking my GPS." A slow, crooked smile spread across the manager's face. He didn't believe me. He handed me a heavy brass key attached to a plastic diamond. "Room 18. Take a left around the building. It's the very last door in the back. Nice and quiet." I thanked him, eager to escape the stifling air of the lobby, and hurried back out to my car. I drove slowly around the corner of the building. The back of the motel was completely hidden from the main road, facing an endless stretch of pitch-black woods. There was only one other vehicle parked back here. A rusted, beat-up pickup truck backed into a spot near the middle of the row. I parked right in front of room 18, grabbed my duffel bag, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I shoved the key into the deadbolt, turned it, and pushed the door open, reaching blindly for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, illuminating the grimy, depressing room. But as the heavy door clicked shut behind me, my eyes immediately locked onto the far wall. There, between the peeling wallpaper and a stained armchair, was an adjoining door. And from the sliver of space at the bottom of the frame, I could see the distinct, unmoving shadow of 2 feet standing just on the other side, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, with my hand still lingering on the cold brass of the doorknob behind me. The rain battered against the single grime-caked window of room 18, but inside, the silence was suffocating. I stared at the bottom of that adjoining door. The pale yellow light bleeding from the neighboring room illuminated the distinct silhouette of two shoes pressed right up against the crack. Someone was standing there, just standing and listening. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. I didn't drop my duffel bag. I didn't take off my soaking wet jacket. I just waited, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It's just a motel, I tried to tell myself, fighting the rising tide of panic. The walls are thin. They probably just heard my door open and walked over to see what the noise was. It's normal. It's fine. As if answering my silent rationalization, the shadows slowly, deliberately shifted. I heard the faint creak of a floorboard, and the silhouette retreated from the gap, disappearing back into the depths of the adjacent room. A heavy, muffled thud followed, like someone sitting down hard on a cheap, springy mattress. I finally let out the breath I'd been holding and forced my legs to move. I locked the deadbolt on my front door and threw the flimsy security chain across the track. It offered little comfort. The screws looked rusted and loose against the cheap particle board of the door frame. I dropped my bag onto the sagging bed and took in my surroundings. Room 18 was a textbook nightmare of neglect. The carpet was a sickly, mottled brown that felt sticky beneath my damp sneakers. The air was thick with the smell of old sweat, industrial bleach, and something cloying and metallic that I didn't want to identify. Above me, a water stain spread across the popcorn ceiling like a dark, creeping bruise. The oppressive atmosphere was making me nauseous. I walked over to the window, intending to crack it open just an inch to let in the cold storm air and flush out the stench. I fumbled with the rusted latch, pressing my palms against the glass and shoving upward. It didn't budge. I tried again, pushing with my shoulders until my muscles ached. Nothing. Peering closer through the smeared grime, I realized why. The frame wasn't just stuck, it had been heavily painted shut. Thick, sloppy layers of white gloss sealed the window entirely to the sill. Looking at the cheap, tamper-proof screws drilled directly into the metal track, I realized this wasn't poor maintenance. This window was intentionally disabled. It was designed never to open. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I turned my attention to the nightstand. A heavy, beige, rotary-style phone sat next to a flickering lamp. I picked up the receiver, suddenly desperate to hear the mundane hum of a dial tone, just to have a connection to the outside world. I pressed the plastic to my ear. Dead air. Not even a hiss of static. I slammed my finger down on the receiver hook repeatedly. Nothing. The line was completely severed. Get out, my instinct screamed. Get back in the car and drive. But my exhaustion was a physical weight dragging me down, and the storm outside was raging harder than ever. I was miles from anywhere, and the thought of navigating that black highway again felt impossible. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. I was severely sleep-deprived and letting my anxiety run wild. I walked into the cramped, moldy bathroom to splash some cold water on my face. The fluorescent tube above the sink hummed with an angry electric buzz. I turned the tap, watching the brownish water sputter before finally running clear. I looked up at my exhausted reflection in the mirror, telling myself to just lock the doors and get through the next 5 hours. But as I turned off the tap, the buzzing of the light fixture wasn't the only sound in the room. Through the paper-thin drywall separating my bathroom from the adjoining room, I heard it. A low, guttural murmur. It wasn't the sound of a late-night television broadcast. It was the distinct sound of two men arguing in hushed, urgent whispers. And then, clear as day through the cheap plaster, I heard one of them say, "Just wait until his lights go out." The words hung in the damp bathroom air, heavy and venomous. Just wait until his lights go out. My blood ran entirely cold. The exhaustion that had been dragging my bones downward vanished, replaced by a violent spike of raw, primal adrenaline. I stood perfectly still over the rusted sink, terrified that even the faint rustle of my damp jacket would betray the fact that I had heard them. I didn't turn the bathroom light off. I didn't flush the toilet or turn the faucet back on. I simply backed out of the tiny room, placing each step carefully on the sticky, mottled carpet to avoid making a single sound. My mind raced, desperately trying to construct a rational explanation to shield my sanity. Maybe they were talking about someone else. Maybe there was a loud television playing a movie in another room. But the absolute, horrifying clarity of that guttural whisper through the cheap drywall left no room for comforting delusions. They were talking about me. I moved back into the center of the main room and stared at the front door. The deadbolt was turned, and the flimsy, rusted chain hung in its track, but the illusion of safety had shattered completely. I needed to see what was happening outside. I needed to know if the night manager was prowling the walkway or if the coast was clear for me to grab my keys and make a mad dash back to my car. I crept up to the heavy wooden door and pressed my eye against the cold brass rim of the peephole. I expected to see a distorted, wide-angle view of the rain-slicked parking lot and my sedan. Instead, my field of vision was impossibly narrow. I could only see a tiny, pinpoint circle of the concrete walkway outside, no wider than a dime. Everything else was blocked by the dark interior casing of the metal cylinder. I pulled my head back, confused, blinking rapidly. I leaned in again, squinting hard into the tiny glass circle. It was exactly like looking through a pair of binoculars the wrong way. Then the sickening realization hit me like a physical punch to the gut. The lens wasn't broken. It was installed backward. Whoever had screwed that peephole into the door didn't want the guests to see out. They wanted anyone standing on the dark walkway outside to have a crystal clear panoramic view of the entire room, to watch me unpack, to watch me sleep, to see exactly where I was sitting when the time came to open the door. I was trapped in a filthy, neon-lit display case. A wave of intense nausea washed over me. My hands shook violently as I dug into my pocket, pulled out a crumpled receipt from a gas station 2 states back, chewed it into a damp wad, and shoved it aggressively into the brass hole, completely blinding the glass. The exact moment my makeshift blind was in place, the noises from the adjoining rooms started up again. It was no longer just the low murmur of voices. It was the distinct, heavy sound of dead weight being dragged across a bare floor. Scrape, thud, scrape. It sounded like a massive piece of wooden furniture, a dresser, or maybe a heavy bed frame being forcefully shoved across the room. But they weren't moving it to barricade their own front door. Based on the direction of the harsh, scraping friction vibrating through the floorboards, they were clearing the space directly in front of the adjoining door. They were making room to come through. I backed away from the front door, my breathing shallow and ragged, my eyes fixed entirely on the thin, painted wood of the connecting door. The scraping abruptly stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on room 18 once again, save for the unrelenting drumming of the roof against the roof. Then, the brass handle of the adjoining door let out a tiny, metallic click. That tiny, metallic click echoed in my skull like a gunshot. I stood frozen in the center of the stained carpet, the stale air leaving my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. My eyes were entirely locked onto the cheap brass knob of the adjoining door. Slowly, agonizingly, the handle began to turn. It didn't twist with the clumsy, accidental bump of someone leaning against the wall. It was deliberate, calculated. The brass rotated millimeter by millimeter, a smooth, silent pressure testing the mechanism. The sliver of light at the bottom of the door darkened again as 2 pairs of shoes, one wearing heavy work boots, the other scuffed sneakers, pressed right up against the threshold. "Don't breathe," my mind screamed at me. "Don't make a single sound." The knob hit the absolute end of its rotation. A tense, heavy silence stretched taut between the 2 rooms. Then, a sharp, violent rattle shook the wood as whoever was on the other side tried to aggressively force the latch open. The deadbolt on my side held, the rusted metal grinding harshly in the frame, but the sheer force of the jiggle made the entire wall shudder. A low, muffled curse bled through the drywall, followed by the distinct sound of retreating footsteps. That was it. I didn't care about the torrential storm, the exhaustion, or the 14 hours of driving I had already endured. I was leaving right now. I grabbed my canvas duffel bag from the sagging mattress, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the straps. I didn't bother packing the wet jacket I had draped over the stained armchair. I just needed my keys. I patted my pockets frantically. Empty. Panic surged hot and bright in my chest until my eyes darted to the rickety nightstand. My car keys were sitting right next to the dead rotary phone. I snatched them up, gripping the jagged metal so hard it bit into my palm. I moved toward the front door, reaching for the deadbolt, but a sudden, paralyzing thought stopped me dead in my tracks. The peephole is backward. If I unlocked my door and stepped out into the night, I would be walking completely blind into whatever was waiting on the walkway. I needed to see the parking lot. I needed to know the path to my car was clear. Leaving the heavy wooden door locked, I crept over to the painted shut window. The cheap plastic blinds were drawn, coated in a thick layer of dust and grime. Using just my index finger, I pried two of the brittle slats apart by a fraction of an inch, pressing my face close to the freezing glass to peer outside. The relentless rain was coming down in thick gray sheets, faintly illuminated by the sickly neon hum of the motel's broken sign. But my eyes immediately bypassed the storm and locked onto my sedan. It wasn't where I had left it. Or rather, it was exactly where I left it, but it was no longer alone. The rusted, beat-up pickup truck I had seen parked a few spaces down was now idling directly behind my car. It was parked completely horizontally across the narrow driving lane, its heavy steel bumper practically kissing my rear trunk. I was perfectly, intentionally boxed in. There was absolutely no room to reverse, and a high concrete parking block prevented me from pulling forward. Through the heavy downpour, the driver's side door of the truck swung open. A figure stepped out into the deluge. Even through the distorted, rain-streaked glass, I recognized the unnervingly tall, gaunt silhouette immediately. It was the night manager. He didn't make a mad dash for cover to escape the freezing rain. He walked with a slow, terrifyingly calm purpose, completely unfazed by the weather soaking through his thin shirt. He wasn't heading toward the main office. He was walking directly toward the covered walkway outside my room. I held my breath, terrified he would look up and see my eye through the cracked blinds. But he didn't even glance at my door. Instead, he stopped right in front of room 17, the adjoining room. He held up a heavy metallic ring of master keys. The heavy metallic jingle of those master keys cut through the sound of the torrential rain like a physical blade. I dropped the plastic blind, stepping back so quickly my heel caught the edge of the stained armchair, nearly sending me sprawling to the grimy floor. I was entirely boxed in. My car, my only lifeline, was wedged against a concrete block with 2 tons of rusted steel parked horizontally across its rear bumper. There was no driving away, even if I managed to make it outside. The night manager, the man who was supposed to be the solitary figure of authority in this desolate place, was the architect of the trap, and he was standing right outside the adjoining room. I pressed my back flat against the wall between the window and the front door, my chest heaving with silent, ragged breaths. Through the thin drywall, I heard the heavy thud of room 17's door opening. It wasn't a cautious greeting, it was the swift, practiced entry of accomplices. "He's in for the night," the manager's raspy voice filtered through the plaster. It sounded terrifyingly clear, entirely devoid of the forced, polite tone he'd used in the lobby. "Car's pinned. You got the plastic?" "Yeah," a deep, gravelly voice replied from inside the neighboring room. "We're good. Give me the ring." A sharp, metallic clatter echoed through the wall as the heavy ring of master keys changed hands. My stomach violently revolted. I clamped a trembling hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp, the metallic tang of pure adrenaline flooding my taste buds. "You got the plastic?" The phrase looped endlessly in my head, painting horrific, violent pictures of what they were preparing to do in that room. Tarps, drop cloths. They weren't just going to rob me. You don't need plastic to steal a wallet and a canvas duffel bag. I had to barricade. I looked wildly around the cramped, depressing dimensions of room 18. The front door had the deadbolt and that pathetic rusted chain. The adjoining door had a simple twist lock on the knob.
Both could be easily bypassed with the master key now sitting in the hands of the men next door. I lunged for the heavy oak veneered dresser pressed against the far wall. It was old, severely water-damaged, and looked like it weighed 100 pounds. I gripped the edges, my knuckles turning white, and threw my entire body weight into pushing it. The wooden legs dug into the sticky, mottled carpet, letting out a low, harsh screech that barely masked the sound of the storm outside. I froze, terrified the noise had alerted them, but the frantic, muffled preparations next door didn't pause. I pushed again, gritting my teeth, ignoring the burning in my shoulders as I dragged the massive dresser across the room. I jammed it mercilessly against the adjoining door, wedging it directly under the brass knob. It wasn't perfect, but the dead weight would buy me seconds if they tried to turn the handle again. But that left the front door completely exposed. If they came from the outside walkway, the flimsy security chain would snap with one solid kick from a heavy work boot. I spun around to the bed. It was a cheap metal frame queen size. I grabbed the edge of the damp mattress and violently heaved it off the box spring, throwing it onto the floor. I grabbed the heavy wooden frame of the box spring itself and began dragging it frantically toward the front entrance. Just as the rough edge of the box spring slammed against the front door, obscuring the handle, I heard it. Click, clack. It wasn't coming from the adjoining door behind the dresser. The sound was coming from right outside my front door. The heavy brass deadbolt, inches from my face, began to slowly, mechanically rotate as a key slid smoothly into the exterior cylinder.
The metallic snick of the deadbolt retracting sounded deafeningly loud over the roar of the rain outside. The brass knob twisted downward with a smooth, oiled click. I threw my entire body weight against a heavy wooden frame of the box spring just as the front door forcefully swung inward. It hit the rusted security chain with a sharp, violent clack, immediately followed by a dull, heavy thud as the door slammed into the barrier I had hastily erected. A 2-inch vertical slice of the freezing storm outside became visible. Through that narrow gap, a pale, wet hand curled around the edge of the door, the knuckles white with tension. The smell of cheap lemon cleaner and damp earth instantly flooded the stagnant air of the room. I planted my damp sneakers firmly into the sticky carpet, pressing my shoulder mercilessly into the box spring. My lungs burned, my vision tunneled. A face appeared in the narrow sliver of open space. It was the night manager. Water dripped from his matted, thinning hair, but his dark, hooded eyes were terrifyingly calm. He wasn't panting. He wasn't acting like a man caught in the middle of a violent break-in. He looked mildly inconvenienced, like a landlord dealing with a stubborn tenant. "Sir," his raspy, dead-leaf voice slithered through the crack, "we have a ruptured pipe in the adjacent room, flooding. I need to come in and check your bathroom plumbing, right now." It was a pathetic, transparent lie. The water was supposed to be the reason to bypass the lock. I didn't answer. I knew if I opened my mouth, the only sound that would come out was a terrified, pathetic whimper. I just pushed harder, burying my shoulder into the fabric of the box spring, feeling the sharp wooden edge bruising my collarbone. "Sir," he repeated, his tone dropping an octave, losing any trace of the polite customer service veneer. "Take the chain off the door." When I still didn't respond, the manager's expression hardened into something predatory and cold. He didn't try to negotiate anymore. He simply leaned his gaunt frame against the heavy exterior door and shoved. The pressure was immense. The rusted security chain groaned in agony. I watched in absolute horror as the tiny, cheap screws anchoring the track to the particle board doorframe began to visibly strip. Tiny flakes of white plaster and wood dust rained down onto the carpet as the metal plate slowly pulled away from the wall. The box spring slid back half an inch, my sneakers skidding on the damp floor. He was going to break through. He was going to snap the chain, push the box spring over, and walk right in. I braced myself for the final, violent impact, squeezing my eyes shut. But instead, the crushing pressure against the door suddenly vanished. The pale fingers uncurled from the edge of the wood. The heavy door swung completely shut with a solid thud.
And then the most terrifying sound of the entire night echoed through the cramped space. Click. He re-engaged the deadbolt from the outside. He had locked me in. My heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against my ribs. Why would he lock it? Why give up when the chain was seconds away from snapping? The answer hit me like a splash of ice water, sending a fresh wave of nausea washing over me. He didn't need the front door. The front door was too exposed to the parking lot even in the dead of night. If I screamed, someone driving by the desolate highway might just maybe hear it. He locked me in because he wanted to force me into a cage. He was sealing the exits. Through the thin drywall, I heard the heavy, wet slosh of his footsteps moving away from my front window and back into room 17 next door. The low, guttural voices immediately resumed, speaking in rapid, hushed tones. I slowly backed away from the box spring, my eyes drifting terrifyingly back to the heavy oak dresser I had wedged against the adjoining door. I thought the dead weight would hold them off. Then, the sickening, high-pitched whine of a cordless power drill revved up on the other side of the wall. They weren't going to force the handle. They were taking the entire adjoining door off its hinges.
The high-pitched whine of the cordless power drill sliced through the thin drywall like a dentist's drill hitting an exposed nerve. It was the most horrifying, calculated sound I'd ever heard. The raw panic that had been a tight knot in my chest exploded outward, making my entire body vibrate with pure, unfiltered terror. They weren't just trying the handle anymore. They were systematically dismantling the only barrier between us. I scrambled away from the heavy box springs still wedged against the front door, my damp sneakers slipping on the sticky, mottled carpet. I tripped over the edge of the bare mattress I'd thrown onto the floor, scraping my palms hard against the rough fiber. I didn't feel it. I scrambled on my hands and knees toward the heavy oak veneer dresser I had shoved against the adjoining door. I pressed my face against the cracked wood of the dresser, desperately peering through the narrow gap between it and the wall. The sliver of yellow light bleeding from room 17 illuminated a horrific scene. The 2 pairs of shoes, the heavy work boots and the scuffed sneakers, were pressed tightly against the threshold. Above them, the sharp, metallic zip of a drill bit biting into the heavy brass hinges vibrated through the floorboards. They were starting from the bottom, working their way up. A small pile of metal shavings and paint dust was already gathering on the edge of the carpet. Zip. A thick, rusted screw hit the floor with a dull clink. "Got the bottom one," the gravelly voice muttered through the plaster, so close he could have been kneeling right next to me. "Hand me the pry bar. This wood's rotted." My blood ran ice cold. A pry bar. They were going to leverage the heavy door right out of the frame the second the hinges were loose. The dead weight of the water-damaged dresser wouldn't stand a chance against 2 grown men forcing a solid wood panel off its tracks. I had to find another way out. The front door was deadbolted from the outside and practically destroyed by the manager's shoulder checks. My car was horizontally boxed in by 2 tons of rusted steel. I spun around wildly, my eyes darting across the depressing, claustrophobic dimensions of room 18. The painted shut window facing the parking lot was my only other option, but the thick, white gloss sealing it to the sill was practically concrete. And even if I managed to break it, the manager could be standing right on the walkway, waiting for me to try exactly that. My gaze snapped to the tiny, moldy bathroom. I bolted across the room, the sticky carpet pulling at my shoes. I slammed the flimsy, hollow-core bathroom door shut behind me. Not that it would offer any real protection, but my mind was desperate for any barrier. I flipped the humming fluorescent tube on, my chest heaving with ragged, frantic breaths. Above the toilet, nestled high on the water-stained wall, was a tiny, rectangular window. It was meant for ventilation, barely 1.5 feet wide, covered in a thick layer of grime and condensation. But more importantly, it was located on the absolute back wall of the motel, facing the endless stretch of pitch-black woods entirely obscured from the parking lot and the walkway. I scrambled onto the closed lid of the toilet, my damp sneakers slipping dangerously on the porcelain. I gripped the edges of the tiny window frame. My knuckles turned bone white as I shoved upward with everything I had. The rusted latch let out a sharp, agonizing squeal, but the frame didn't budge a millimeter.
The cold metal track was completely rusted shut, cemented by years of neglect and damp air. Zip! The shrill scream of the power drill echoed from the main room. Clink! Another screw hit the floor. I was running completely out of time. They were halfway through the top hinge. I could hear the heavy wood of the adjoining door groan as the pry bar wedged into the gap.
The groan of the pry bar in the next room was a sickening guttural sound, like thick bones snapping under immense pressure. The wood of the adjoining door shrieked in protest as the men next door leaned their combined weight into the steel lever. I stood precariously balanced on the closed toilet seat, my damp sneakers slipping against the curved porcelain. The tiny ventilation window above me was my only way out, but the rusted metal track was fused solid. I hammered the heel of my hand against the frame, ignoring the sharp, stinging pain blooming across my palm. It was completely useless. It was permanently sealed by decades of moisture and neglect. From the main room, a deafening crack echoed off the cheap drywall. The top hinge had completely given way. "Push it," the gravelly voice grunted, breathless from the exertion. "The whole frame is rotting out. Just shove the damn thing." A tremendous, heavy scrape vibrated through the floorboards. The massive oak veneered dresser I had wedged under the knob was moving. The dead weight I had foolishly relied on was simply sliding across the sticky, mottled carpet, yielding to the raw, violent force of the two men pushing from the other side. I had seconds, literally seconds. I couldn't open the window, which meant I had to break it. I looked frantically around the tiny, mold-stained bathroom. There was nothing, just a flimsy plastic trash can, a threadbare towel, and a rusted shower head. My eyes darted downward. The toilet tank. I hopped down from the seat, my wet shoes squeaking against the peeling linoleum. I grabbed the heavy ceramic lid of the water tank and hoisted it up. It weighed easily 15 pounds, a solid, unwieldy slab of dense porcelain. In the main room, the dresser let out a final, agonizing screech against the carpet. The adjoining door slammed open with an explosive crash, the heavy wood rebounding hard off the wall. Heavy, wet work boots hit the floor of room 18. "Where is he?" the night manager's raspy voice hissed. I didn't hesitate. I swung the heavy ceramic tank lid upward like a battering ram, driving the corner of it directly into the center of the frosted glass window. The impact was deafening in the tiled, claustrophobic space. The glass didn't shatter into tiny pieces. It broke in massive, sharp shards that rained down onto the sink and the floor. I swung the lid again, frantically clearing the rusted metal frame of the largest, deadliest pieces, oblivious to the ceramic shards slicing into the back of my hand. The explosive sound of the breaking glass instantly killed the silence in the main room. "Bathroom!" the gravelly voice barked. Heavy, thundering footsteps charged across the short distance of the motel room, shaking the entire floor. I dropped the ceramic lid. It shattered into a dozen pieces against the linoleum and scrambled back onto the toilet seat. The freezing, torrential rain immediately whipped through the broken window, slapping me in the face and soaking my shirt. The opening was impossibly small, a narrow rectangle of absolute blackness. I thrust my head and shoulders through the jagged frame. The remnants of broken glass tore through my thin shirt, scraping aggressively against my ribs and stomach, but the sheer adrenaline masked the pain. I was halfway out, my chest resting on the rusted sill, the freezing storm instantly engulfing the top half of my body. Behind me, the hollow-core bathroom door rattled violently. The lock was a pathetic push-button mechanism on the handle. "He's going out the back!" the gravelly voice yelled. A heavy boot slammed into the center of the bathroom door. The flimsy push-button lock bowed inward with a terrifying crack, the hollow interior splintering under the impact. I kicked my legs frantically, trying to find leverage against the slippery porcelain of the toilet tank to push the rest of my hips through the tight metal frame. Another massive kick hit the bathroom door. The flimsy push-button lock exploded inward, the metal strike plate rocketing across the tiny room as the door flew open.
I lunged forward into the rain, but just as my hips cleared the rusted windowsill, I felt a cold, wet hand clamp down violently around my left ankle.
The grip on my left ankle was like a vice of solid iron. The fingers dug painfully into my Achilles tendon, freezing cold and incredibly strong. A terrifying, guttural grunt echoed from inside the tiny bathroom as the unseen man threw his weight backward, trying to forcefully drag me back through the jagged window frame. The rusted metal sill bit savagely into my stomach. Remaining shards of broken glass that I hadn't managed to clear sliced through my wet shirt, tracing hot lines of fire across my ribs as I was pulled backward by an inch. "Got him!" the gravelly voice roared, echoing sharply off the tile. "Grab his other leg!" Pure, unadulterated survival instinct hijacked my brain. I didn't think, I just reacted. I drew my free right leg up into my chest as far as the cramped dimensions of the window would allow, and I blindly pissed into my damp sneaker backward with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength I possessed. My heel connected with a sickening, wet crunch. It felt like I had kicked a piece of raw meat draped over a cinder block. The man let out a sharp, choked gasp of pure agony, and the crushing pressure on my ankle instantly vanished. I didn't wait for him to recover. I threw my entire upper body weight forward, diving headfirst into the pitch-black void outside. I plummeted about 5 feet, crashing violently into a thick patch of thorny weeds and freezing, saturated mud. The impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, leaving me gasping in the torrential downpour. But the sound of the night manager's deadly voice barking orders through the broken window instantly spurred me into motion. "Get around the building! Take the truck!" I scrambled to my hands and knees, the thick mud aggressively sucking at my palms. My chest and stomach burned fiercely from the glass cuts, and my ankle throbbed where the man had grabbed me, but my legs worked. I pushed myself upright and began to run blindly into the desolate, overgrown field behind the motel. The storm was a solid wall of water, masking the sound of my frantic splashing footsteps, but completely blinding me. I had no flashlight, no phone, no keys, and no sense of direction other than away. I tore through waist-high brush, unseen thorns tearing at my jeans and exposed hands. Behind me, the sickly neon glow of the Starlight Inn was fading behind the curtain of the rain, but it was quickly replaced by something far more terrifying. Twin beams of brilliant white light swept across the edge of the woods. It was the rusted pickup truck. The heavy engine roared to life over the sound of the thunder, its high beams cutting aggressively through the deluge, searching the tree line. I dropped flat into the freezing mud, pressing my face into the soggy earth as the beam of light washed over the tall brush just a few feet above my head. The truck was crawling along the perimeter of the motel's back lot, the tires churning loudly in the wet gravel. "I don't see him," a voice yelled from the rolled-down window of the truck. "He's on foot in a storm. He can't get far," the manager's unmistakable voice replied, his tone chillingly detached. "Circle the access road. If he heads for the highway, we'll catch him in the headlights." The truck accelerated, its red taillights bleeding into the dark as it sped toward the unlit 2-lane blacktop that connected the motel to the main highway. My stomach plummeted into free fall. They were intentionally cutting off my only logical escape route. If I tried to walk the 2 miles back to the interstate, I would be walking right into their patrol. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, bleeding, freezing to death, and being actively hunted by men who clearly had a practiced system for making solo travelers disappear. I didn't get up. Standing would make me a silhouette against the sparse gray light of the storm. Instead, I crawled. I dragged my battered, freezing body through the saturated mud and thorny underbrush, moving perpendicular to the access road, plunging entirely into the pitch-black woods. Every inch was pure agony. The glass cuts across my ribs burned with the dirty water seeping into them, and my left ankle throbbed with a sickening hot pulse every time it caught on a hidden root. But the sheer primal terror of the truck's engine growling in the distance pushed me forward. For what felt like hours, I navigated the blind, suffocating darkness. Twice, the rusted pickup rolled slowly down the adjacent blacktop, its blinding high beams sweeping violently through the trees. Both times I buried my face in the freezing mud, holding my breath until my lungs screamed, praying the dense brush would hide my shivering form. They hunted me until the rain finally broke. By the time the sky shifted from absolute black to a bruised, sickly pre-dawn gray, the sound of the truck had vanished, replaced by the distant, rhythmic hum of tires on wet pavement. The interstate. I stumbled out of the tree line entirely by accident, tumbling down a steep embankment and crashing into the metal guardrail of the highway. I was a horrific sight, soaked in freezing mud, my shirt torn to ribbons, bleeding freely from my stomach and hands. I practically threw my broken body into the right lane, violently waving my uninjured arm. A passing 18-wheeler locked its air brakes, the massive rig hissing and shuddering to a halt just yards away from me. The trucker took one look at my state, locked his doors, and immediately called 911. I gave my statement from the back of an ambulance, wrapped in 3 thermal blankets, my teeth chattering so violently I could barely speak. Within the hour, 2 county sheriff's cruisers tore down the exit ramp, heading straight for the Starlight Inn. When the deputies arrived, the motel was completely dead. The buzzing neon sign was switched off, the lobby was locked, and the rusted pickup truck was gone. My sedan had completely vanished from the lot, likely driven off using the keys I had desperately left sitting on the nightstand when I fled. The night manager and the men in room 17 were ghosts. But it was what the police found inside the motel that still keeps me awake at night. When they breached room 17, they found exactly what I had heard the men preparing. The floor was meticulously lined with thick industrial-grade plastic drop cloths, taped down at the edges to prevent anything from seeping into the carpet. In the corner, next to the heavy pry bar they used to break down my door, sat a duffel bag filled with heavy-duty zip ties, a roll of duct tape, and a set of folding knives. The most terrifying discovery, however, wasn't in the adjacent room. It was in the main office. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind the scuffed plexiglass check-in counter, investigators found a rusted metal lockbox. Inside was a collection of personal effects. There were 12 different driver's licenses, all belonging to young, out-of-state solo travelers. There were a dozen solitary car keys, cheap watches, and dead cell phones. I was supposed to be number 13. They never caught the night manager. The name he used on the motel's lease was a forgery, and the property had been quietly foreclosed on months prior. They were simply squatting, using the abandoned building to lure in exhausted, desperate people who thought they were finding a safe haven from the dark. I still drive late at night sometimes, but I never take the desolate exits anymore. And if I ever find myself pulling into a lonely, neon-lit room, the very first thing I check before I even put my bags down is the peephole.